Alrighty. Appreciated that prayer, Jeremiah, because sometimes people's struggle is hardness of heart. And I know when I've been in that situation, it's a hard struggle to get over when the heart is hard for whatever reason. Mark chapter 7. Let's open to that chapter. Now here in Mark chapter 7, Mark is continuing to give his record of the public ministry of Jesus, but as was mentioned last time, this Mark kind of enters into a new section where Jesus, up to this point, has been dealing with the crowds in general, but now here in chapter 7, who's he dealing with? The Pharisees, and by extension, the scribes, they also tell us. Now, as we know, the scribes and the Pharisees, they were the religious leaders of the day. And what Jesus confronts them on in this particular chapter is the fact that they put the traditions of man or men over and above the commandments of God. Now, does anyone remember what the particular issue at hand here in chapter 7 is about? Not washing their hands before they eat, and we even learned that even the dishes had to be washed before they eat. And they got it in their heads that washing your hands and the dishes is something God wanted you to do. If you did not do it, you're unclean before God, is what this chapter deals with. And so, given that the traditions of man over and above the commandments of God were an issue during Jesus' public ministry, and that there was this, what I'm calling a misunderstanding about what made a person impure before God, it is for this reason that Mark records in verse 14, writing, "After he called the crowd to him again, he began saying to them, 'Listen to me, all of you, and understand.'" Now, what are we being told there in verse 14? What's the scene? Okay, and what does Jesus say? Hear me, everyone, and understand. So Jesus is about to call the crowd's attention to something. Now, before this point, given that the text says, "called the crowd to him again," this indicates to us that what occurred between he and the religious leaders was probably more of a private setting. But now that's happened. Now Jesus comes out and calls the crowd to him and says this statement we read here. The New American Standard renders it, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand." So what's he calling for here? He's calling their attention, but for what purpose? Okay, to learn, to get them to understand something, to put something in their minds. Now, in verse 14, Mark does not yet address what that is, but he will in verse 15. Anything else on verse 14? All right. So Jesus has called the crowd to himself. It's basically saying, "Listen to me. I want you to understand something." And verse 15 tells us what that is. The text says, "There is nothing outside the man which can defile him if it goes into him, but the things which proceed out of the man are what defile the man." So we can read what the words of Jesus are, but can anyone tell me what he's saying? Okay, that might be part of it. I mean, choice is involved, but he uses this word defile. Does everyone have the word defile, or does anyone have a different word? Okay. So we have this word defile that he uses, but he uses it in this context of saying there's nothing outside the man, is the first phrase we run into there. Now, Unclean? Okay.
NIV does.
Okay, that's where the word defile has the idea of being unclean. But he says there's nothing outside the man which can defile him if it goes into him. What do you hear that saying?
Where you're not going to eat anything or anything of that notion that's going to make you unclean.
That's go ahead, Don. Sorry.
That's it. Or other things too, by the way.
In this case, as I'll draw your attention to as we get into this, is yes, Jesus we have to remember the scene, first of all, before I get to my next thought. The scene is, verses 1 through 13, Jesus and his disciples sitting down to a meal. They get called on the fact that they haven't washed their hands, let alone their dishes, before they eat. So he is talking about food here. There's no food which you can take into yourself that will make you unclean before God. So that means I can go down the street and eat Taco Bell and still be okay with God. Just kidding. Or Wendy's, any one of those restaurants that I enjoy. But that's besides the point. But Jesus' point here is there's nothing you can eat, nothing you can take into yourself as far as food or drink is concerned that'll make you impure before God. But what is the case that will make you impure before God? What comes out? Now, he's not talking about food. He's going to talk about what comes out of us.
Your words and your actions.
Your words and your actions. We're going to get to that thought here in just a few verses. But this is the point he's making. There's nothing you can eat. There's nothing that goes into you as far as food or drink is concerned that can make you unclean. Now, at this point, there are dietary laws in place, but we're going to address that in this study as well in just a few verses. But Jesus is making the point again, there's nothing you can take into yourself that'll make you impure before God. Again, food and drink. Instead, it's what comes out that makes you impure before God. So that's the point. Questions or comments on verse 15? Okay, before we leave verse 15, something else we should know about this statement is we know from verse 17 that what Jesus says here in verse 15 is a parable of sorts. Again, verse 17 tells us that very clearly, and we'll get there. Now, what is a parable? Can anyone remind me? Okay, that's the definition you usually hear, earthly story with spiritual meaning. Any other ideas? Exactly. It's a statement. We usually think of parables in terms of stories. And there are stories, like the parable of the sower, for example. But parables are not always stories. They're just statements that are made to get across a point. That's what this is. It's not a story Jesus tells. It's just a point that he's making. And again, it's verse 17 that tells us this is a parable. But again, the statement here has primarily to do with food. It's not food that makes you unclean before God. It's what comes out. So going on to verse 16, we find this next statement. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. Now, does anyone have a special note or anything on verse 16 in their Bibles? Okay, some of you won't have verse 16. What's that, Jeremiah? That's important to know. Some of you, I'm glad you pointed out, you don't have verse 16. There's a reason for that. It's because some of the earliest manuscripts don't contain this remark, let he who has ears, let him hear. I did not know about the Dead Sea Scrolls thing. It's now been removed from Bibles entirely, sounds like. But that's okay. The reason it seems to be included by some is because this statement It was a common one after the parables of Jesus that he'd make this call. So even though it's not necessarily included in the original manuscripts, it's not bad for it to be there if you have it at all in your Bibles. But since it is there, we'll just deal with it briefly. It's just an expression that says, if you have spiritual ears, hear what I'm saying, is what Jesus says. So it's not just listening to the words, it's understanding what the words mean. If we're going to understand them, we've got to be listening with our spiritual ears, not just our physical ears. Anything else on verse 16 if you have it? All right. So Jesus has made the point of verse 15. We've dealt with verse 16. What verse 17 goes on to tell us what happens next. When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples questioned him about the parable. So what does verse 17 tell us? What happened after what we've discussed so far? Disciples didn't get it. Where are they? At the house, away from the crowd. It's someplace they were staying. So yes, we're again with the scribes and Pharisees, possibly a private setting, crowd, public setting. We're back to a private setting in the confines of this house, wherever it is. But yes, the point being made here is that Jesus' followers, likely the apostles, were asking Jesus, what was this parable about? What did it mean? Is what they're asking. Questions or comments on verse 17? Sandy? Yeah, the New American Standard has disciples too, but sometimes the disciples is a reference to the apostles, but it's hard to tell sometimes. Jeremiah?
That Greek word is not for the apostles, it's for large collective of all the people who follow Jesus, or that huge group that we would think of, not the 12, the word they use for the 12, not
Okay.
the same word. So it'd be more likely larger.
Okay, so yeah, just based on how the Greek's rendered here, according to Jeremiah, is just, yeah, it could be the crowd here. But that crowd, all the same, would include the apostles. Dean, go ahead. You just have a footnote there? Okay. I don't think we need to do that tonight. Go to Matthew 15:15. It's probably just a parallel statement. Anything else on verse 17? Okay. So we have verses 14 through 17. These three verses that we just looked at really set the stage for what Mark is going to go on to record for us in verses 18 through 23 of this chapter, where Jesus goes on to explain this parable, and we'll make 2 points in doing that about what the parable that he stated meant, more specifically what it declared. In verses 18 and 19, we'll see that Jesus makes the point that the parable declared all foods clean, and we'll talk about that. In verses 20 through 23, Jesus makes the point that the parable declared that the heart of men is unclean. So these are the points we're going to look at, and after looking at these things, we'll see that part of the purpose of parables was to make declarations about something. So we'll start by reading verses 18 through 23, and then we'll look at the points. Again, Mark chapter 7, beginning in verse 18, the text says, "And he said to them, 'Are you so lacking in understanding also? Do you not understand that whatever goes into the man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach and is eliminated?' Thus he declared all foods clean. And he was saying, that which proceeds out of the man, that is what defiles the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed the evil thoughts, fornications, thefts, murders, adulteries, deeds of coveting and wickedness, as well as deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things proceed from within and defile the man." So again, we're looking at the meaning of this parable this one statement parable that Jesus has given. And we're looking at what it declared. First of all, it declared that all food is clean, ritually clean, in the religious sense. But this point is introduced with Jesus asking a question in order to make the point that is not what goes into the man from outside that defiles him, but what's the question he asked? Okay, that's the point that he makes, but what's the question he asked? Are you still not understanding? They're in verse 18. He's saying, don't you get it? Is what he's saying to them. But what are they not understanding according to this verse? We already talked about it. What's the point they're not getting? That what you eat doesn't defile you. It's not what you take in terms of food that makes you impure before God. It's not the cheeseburger at Wendy's that makes you impure before God. It's not P.F. Chang's, Don, that makes you impure before God. I say that because Don loves P.F. Chang's, as do I. But yes, Jesus is saying, don't you get it? It's not what you eat that makes you impure before God. Again, there's some dietary laws in place, but Jesus is about to remove those through this statement that he makes, and Mark's going to note that for us. Questions or comments on verse 18? All right. Verse 19. Jesus goes on to explain the reason verse 18 is true. Why is verse 18 true according to verse 19? Okay, what you digest goes into the belly, not your heart. What heart is he talking about? The conscience, who you are. He's not saying the food goes into this muscle in your chest. It's the inner man. Elaine, go ahead. Exactly. It is pretty huge because they are used to these dietary laws. Don't eat pork. Stay away from these things because they're unclean. You touch them, they'll make you unclean. So yes, Jesus is making a very bold statement here. It's not what you eat that makes you unclean, including the bacon cooking on the skillet. Now, those are my words. Yes, that's true. Right, and that, right, exactly. From what we know, Mark's original audience was primarily Gentile. And that's why he inserts some of these little statements that we find that explain why this is a big deal. But coming back to Jesus' words here, part of the reason food doesn't make you unclean is because of what happens to it. According to this verse, what happens to food after you eat it? It's digested, it's expelled. Now, before we get too far into that, what else happened when Jesus said this? What did it declare? All foods clean. All foods. Bacon. Other things that Jews were not otherwise allowed to consume. But his point here is about the fact that food does not make you unclean, because it goes into your stomach and you poop it out. Let me tell you why that's why he's saying what he's saying. Because this word eliminated, it comes from a word that literally refers to a first century toilet. True story. But what Jesus says here refers to the fact that what a person eats doesn't go into your inner man, the heart. It goes into your stomach, you poop it out. But Mark adds here that in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean, saying to the Jews, you can now eat bacon. Have those pork chops your friend across the river is cooking. But clean means pure, religiously pure. I'm sorry, Andrew, were you about to say something?
Even though to us this seems pretty plain, it's a hard thing for the Jewish followers to accept and believe.
Exactly. And not
Caused a lot of controversy,
exactly. This is one more
but it seems plain enough.
yeah.
Pretty straightforward. Why did they have a problem with that? Is that happening in culture?
Right. It's important to keep the culture and history in mind. But even after the cross, they still didn't get it. How do we know? Acts chapter 10. Peter goes to sleep. See the sheet come down, all these unclean foods on it. God says, eat. God, no, I've never eaten anything unclean. Well, now it is clean, Peter. Now, the purpose in that was to point Peter over to the Gentiles, the Cornelius story. But it's the same situation. Peter, the great apostle, didn't get it. Neither did the rest of the apostles at this point. But this is all about this one statement parable that Jesus has made. What did it mean? It declared all foods clean. All foods were now ritually pure just because Jesus said they were, through that statement he made in verse 15. But why is it clean? Because food does not change your inner man. It doesn't change your relationship with God. Again, the cheeseburger at Wendy's doesn't change my relationship with God. Trying to think of another good restaurant, what's not coming to mind. But instead, it's what comes out of the heart. It's what Jesus will point out that makes a person unclean. Anything else on verses 18 or 19? All right. So the second point that was made through the parable in verses 20 through 23 is that it declared that the heart of man is ritually unclean. So Mark begins in verse 20. What does the text say? What comes out of a person? It's not what goes in, food. It's what comes out that makes a person unclean. Questions or comments on that? Yeah, we'll look at the list here in just a minute. Anything else on verse 20, though? Okay. So verses 21 and 22, we're just going to take them together because this is a list that we're looking at. I love lists. But the point of this list is to emphasize the point of verse 20. That's what comes out of a man that makes him impure before God. The fruit, the produce. Now we have this list, and again we'll look at the list, but according to the beginning of verse 21, where do all the things in this list come from? From the heart. Again, not this thing that's pumping blood through our bodies, but our true selves, our inner man. And so we have the list. It's a list of examples of sinful behaviors that have their source in the inner man rather than in the physical body. So item number 1 on this list is evil thoughts. What are evil thoughts? Okay, not good things. What are thoughts? Let's boil it down even more. Ideas we have, things we're thinking about. Guess what? Those thoughts we have come from the heart. And if they're evil, they're thoughts that are contrary to what God is thinking. And we know that because this word evil, it's just a general term for everything that is opposed to God. Questions on the first item on the list? All right. We are going to move through these pretty quickly, but the second example is fornications. This word fornications, it comes from the same word we get the word pornography, a term we're familiar with. But in this context, it refers to all kinds of immoral sexual behavior. Immoral sexual behavior, according to Jesus, begins in the heart. He dealt with that in Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. He said adultery begins in the heart. And we'll get to adultery here in just a moment. Next, the third example Jesus gives of things that come from the inner man is thefts. What are thefts? Stealing. It's that simple. Stealing begins in the heart. I'm going to make a decision to steal that. I'm going to go through and steal Don's nice truck. It starts here. It starts here. Don, I'm not going to steal your truck. Don't worry. The next example is murders. What's murders? Killing someone, taking an innocent life. Example number 5 is adultery. Now, adultery is similar to fornications, but it's more specific. It refers to married people. Fornication is kind of broad, any sexual immoral behavior. Adultery refers to being unfaithful toward your spouse in a sexual way, going out and having relations with someone who's not your spouse. So adultery is a little more specific than fornications. The next 2 items on this list seem to go together. Jesus phrases it as deeds of coveting and wickedness. Now, does everyone have the word coveting there, or do they have a different word? Greed? Okay. Greed's not a bad word because that's what coveting is. So you see something you want, you're going to do everything you can to get it. But it's coming from that sense of greed, not that innocent desire, but greed. And that's why it's paired with wickedness. Because since you're going to do everything you can to get something, you're going to break some laws along the way, namely God's laws. That's where the wickedness comes in. Again, these 2 seem to go together. Questions or comments on that one before we move to deceit? Okay. Example number 8, deceit. What is deceit? Lying. Dealing falsely with others. Again, begins in the heart. Next, envy. Anyone tell me what envy is? Before I tell you about it. Okay, jealousy. Oh, I'm sorry, Sean, I didn't hear you. Yes, envy, it's a strong form of jealousy. Now, jealousy in its simple form is, well, they got something I wanted. Envy takes it a step further. They got something I want, I'm going to go after it. But something else we should know about the term envy here is that the word for it could literally be translated as evil eye. I wish they'd have translated it that way because it's the word for eye. You have evil eye? Okay, that's good. But it's used here in this context of this list to make a point that you're looking at things that you want, but looking at those things in a way that is opposed to God. To go after them even if you have to disobey God to do it. Questions or comments on envy and the evil eye concept? Okay. Next, example number 11 is slander. Can anyone tell me what slander is? Okay, saying hurtful, untrue things about somebody. We might call it today gossip. Now, as far as the word here is concerned, it comes from the same word that's translated as blasphemy. Blasphemy is the same idea, speaking out against someone or something with the intention of harming them. Questions on blasphemy or slander? Okay. Next is pride. There's a loaded term for you. What is pride? What's that? Being puffed up. When you're puffed up, what's another word for that? You have proud talking? Okay, I did not come across that. Good. That's where I was headed toward. It is. It's that arrogance. I'm better than you. Your relationship with God, I'm better than God. I know better. I don't need Jesus. I know better. I can make it on my own. That's pride. Thinking you're better than you are. Finally, foolishness. What is foolishness? Okay, pretty much what people do. Explain that to us, Dean. It's not smart. It's somebody who's being silly. I'm not going to use the ST word because my daughter's here. But yes, you're not smart. Now, something else we should know about this word, it seems to summarize the list. Because if you're doing all these other things that we've looked at, it shows you're foolish. And in the biblical context, being foolish has to do with not doing things God's way. Therefore, the opposite of that is wisdom. James gets pretty heavy into that in James chapter 1. And so this final example on the list summarizes all the other 12 that we've looked at. Because if you're engaged in all these things, you're foolish. You're exhibiting foolishness. But putting it into the context, if you're doing these things, if you're being foolish in this way, guess what? You're unclean. Because all these things that you're doing are coming out of your heart. And Jesus summarizes with what he'll say in verse 23. But any other questions or comments on the list? Okay. So verse 23, Jesus summarizes what he said by saying, all these evil things proceed from within and defile the man. What are the evil things he's talking about? The list. What's the point he's making about the list here in verse 23? They're evil, and what do? They defile the man. All these behaviors, all these things are what make you unclean before God. So he's summarizing by saying that everything he listed in verses 21 and 22, they come out of a person. They don't go in, they come out. And since they do come out, that's what makes them impure, unclean. So it's this statement that tells us that at this point, Jesus has something in mind far greater than food. It's not food that defiles a person. It's what comes out of the heart. So again, based on verse 21, what defiles a person or makes them ritually impure are the things that come from their heart, their inner man. Questions or comments on verse 23? Okay. That's true. That's true. Exactly. Exactly. They creep up on you. I know it happens to me, especially when something doesn't go my way. Those thoughts enter in. But those bad things can influence our thoughts. But that's just one item on the list that Jesus has given. There's all these other things, but the point is they come out of the heart. And it's what comes out of the heart that makes a man ritually unclean. That's verses 20 through 23, the point. But we ask, why is the heart of man ritually unclean? It's because it is from the heart that the things opposed to God come. All sin begins in the heart. Again, you can look at the Matthew chapter 5, proves that. So it's not what goes into a person, like food, that makes them pure before God, but instead what comes out of a person, like these things Jesus has listed. So, putting verses 14 through 23 of this chapter together, the point we should be left with is that the parable Jesus told declared something. It declared all foods clean. It declared that the heart of man was unclean. So that's what parables do. They make declarations. All the parables of Jesus that we read are meant to make a declaration of some sort. Since this is true, this is why Jesus often ended his parables with, if anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. Now again, it's not necessarily here in Mark chapter 7, that statement, but we do find it in other contexts of parables. So our responsibility in this is to not only use our physical ears to hear the parables of Jesus, but also to use our spiritual ears, so that we can hear these declarations that Jesus makes in his parables. If we do that, put on our spiritual ears, then we'll be able to truly understand the parables of Jesus as they are revealed not only here, but in all the Gospels. And the result will be that we'll gain a greater understanding of the teachings of Jesus and come into a closer relationship with him. Again, those are just some applications from what we've studied today. Anything else? No? Okay. Matt, will you close us tonight?